Medieval Europe was a graveyard of the living. Disease was not an exception, it was the rule. But in the summer of 1518, a horror descended on the city of Strasbourg that was unlike any pox or fever. It didn't start with a cough or a boil. It started with a step. On a hot July day, a woman named Frau Trophea stepped out of her home. There was no music, there was no celebration. But suddenly, her body was seized by a rhythm that no one else could hear. She began to dance, not with joy, but with compulsion. Her husband watched in confusion, then horror, as she thrashed through the streets all day long. Night fell, and the silence of the city was broken only by the rhythmic thudding of her feet against the stone. She stopped only for a few hours of fitful, restless sleep before waking the next dawn to begin the nightmare again. By the second day, her feet were bruised and bloody. A crowd gathered, not to join in, but to gawk at the insane woman dancing herself toward a very possible death. They thought it was a spectacle. They didn't know it was an infection. Madness, it seems, is contagious. Within days, Frau Trophea was no longer a solo act. The unseen puppeteer claimed others. First one, then another. Soon, a troop of 30 people had caught the jitterbug, their bodies hijacked by the same inexplicable urge. This was not a festival. It was a crisis. The dancing mania spread like wildfire through Strasbourg. Estimates suggest that upwards of 400 people were eventually pulled into this vortex, involuntarily joining the macabre dance crew. The city council was paralyzed. They were trained for war and taxes, not spontaneous raves of the damned. The only thing clear to them was the suffering. These were not revelers having a groovy time. The victims were in obvious pain, screaming in agony, begging for mercy from a bizarre affliction they could not control. As the summer heat intensified, so did the death toll. Bodies began to drop mid-stride. 15 people a day were dying, hearts bursting, bodies collapsing from sheer exhaustion, dancing straight into their graves. Desperate, the council consulted local physicians. They ruled out the stars. They ruled out ghosts. The diagnosis? Hot blood. The doctors believed the victims' brains were overheating, causing madness due to imbalanced humors. In the 1500s, the standard solution was the knife bloodletting. But how do you bleed a patient who refuses to stand still? Since they couldn't cut the sickness out, they decided to burn it out. The prescription was more dancing. The authorities believed that if they could just keep the victims moving, they would exhaust the mania. They hired musicians. They brought in professional dancers to mix with the afflicted. It was a catastrophic error. Like a poorly chaperoned prom from hell, the cure only exacerbated the problem. As the exhausted dancers began to stumble, the musicians, misunderstanding their assignment, didn't slow down. They sped up. They played faster. The tempo rose, forcing the townspeople to move with even greater violence. The music didn't exorcise the demon. It summoned more victims. Passers-by, hearing the beat, were drawn into the square, mistaking the horror for a party, only to be trapped in the rhythm themselves. The block party strategy had failed. The council realized this wasn't hot blood. It was a curse. To the medieval mind, such suffering could only be a divine receipt for unpaid moral debts. The city clamped down. Gambling houses were closed. Brothels were shuttered. They banished the loose people and donated a massive 100-pound candle to the cathedral, hoping to bribe the saints into mercy. When that didn't work, they outlawed movement itself. A fine of 30 shillings was levied on anyone caught moving their hips to a beat. Music was banned, specifically drums and tambourines, which were thought to trigger the epidemic. But the people knew who to blame. They whispered the name of a boy martyr who died in the year 303, Saint Vitus. Legend said he was boiled in lead and tar, then fed to lions who refused to eat him. He was the patron saint of trembling limbs. This was not just a plague. It was Saint Vitus's dance. Running out of options, The city took a big swing. They loaded the afflicted onto wagons and carted them up a mountain to a shrine dedicated to Saint Vitus. At the altar, the dancers collapsed. The priests performed mass. They handed out small crosses and strangely red shoes blessed with holy oil. Whether by divine intervention or the power of suggestion, the red shoes worked. The affliction broke. The survivors regained control of their own bodies, leaving the nightmare on the mountain. But what really happened in 1518? Was it ergot poisoning from moldy grain? Unlikely that causes convulsions, not coordinated dance. Was it a secret heretical cult? No, the victims were in too much agony for that. The truth is perhaps more terrifying than a curse. Strasbourg had suffered 4 famines in 20 years. Smallpox and leprosy were stalking the streets. Orphanages were overflowing. The people were starving, terrified, and broken. It was likely mass hysteria. Their minds were so fractured by trauma, so convinced that they were possessed by a higher power, that their bodies simply obeyed. They believed they had no control, and so they lost it. In the end, the dancing plague of 1518 serves as a grim reminder. When the human mind breaks, it doesn't always scream. Sometimes it dances.